So now we're going to have a different perspective on climate change adaptation from Djarra Delaney. Djarra is a Quandamuka person from Menjeraba, which is North Stratoboak Island, Malgimpin, Moreton Island, and the surrounding land and sea country. Djarra is a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, examining climate change adaptation with Indigenous context. In a prior professional capacity, he managed the Indigenous weather knowledge website at the Bureau of Meteorology. So his research at the university is grounded in the understanding of climate change as a consequence of colonialism, but adaptation takes place within colonial systems of power, and to be effective must rather be grounded in decolonial principles if it hopes to achieve a positive adaptation outcome for Indigenous people. So I'm intrigued to hear you present to us, Djarra. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. So first off, I've got to want to do some acknowledgements. So first, I want to acknowledge the Aranda country and the peoples where we're meeting today, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging leaders. Now, I've got some photographs that I took as well. So that's on Quandamuka country. So I want to also acknowledge and pay respects to my country and my elders who give us guidance and knowledge. And also some photos from Masig Island, which is the country of the Masig-Argal people of the Kolkagol Nation. So I want to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging as well. And finally, to the Wurundjeri people as well. That's where I live, in Collingwood, in Melbourne. So yeah, that's that. All right. Yeah, so this presentation, hopefully everyone's not too boggled from 4 days of talk. So I'm gonna have some photos and kind of have more of a discussion around the realities of adaptation within kind of on the ground and that local scale that I think is a nice complement to Mark's talk of the kind of that higher governance structure globally. So let's have a look. So I want to thank again, Mark has done a lot of what is adaptation, so I don't have to go over it too much, but yeah, essentially it's an adjustment to the impacts of climate. And I just want to, it also occurs at different scales. So that adjustment, again, can happen global through national down to kind of community and personal as well. So, I think from my experience, I've seen a few different kind of types of adaptation. You can have like behavioral change, which I'll talk a bit about in a few slides on a photo. Physical, obviously that kind of physical adaptation in the environment, which I'll talk to again. Community, social, cultural, so how we change our kind of systems and our approach, and then wider again, systemic. So again, adjusting those institutional arrangements to better address some of those concerns that are there. And yeah, so again, in the similar kind of that bubble graph, adaptation is really intersectional. So particularly for communities like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities or other Indigenous communities overseas, or generally marginalized communities, where the process for adaptation intersects really heavily with other areas. So whether or not that's health and well-being, or economics, or histories of movement, or histories of violence, or histories of epistemic exclusion, which is knowledge exclusion, things like that. So it's extremely intersectional, and it occurs at a kind of point where what I kind of argue is that we have to make a choice about how we're going to pursue adaptation so that we don't necessarily reinforce the same systems that are causing all those problems. So talk a little bit about that, but it'll be in more of a discussion format. All right. And I want to talk a bit about these terms that pop up again, like vulnerability and resilience is often, you'll often find those kind of talked about within the context of adaptation. So oftentimes Indigenous communities will be classified as quite vulnerable, which is true. But I think a truth-telling process needs to be had there around why that necessarily has occurred. So we've heard actually quite a little bit about that. So for example, poorer communities often live in more impact-prone areas because of, rich kind of colonial histories of taking all that kind of high ground and other things, and moving Indigenous people and forced moving of locations. So I'll talk about it too, but for Quandamooka country, when we were moved to a mission at Myora Springs, and then slowly kind of allowed to move back into an area called 1 Mile, which is 1 mile out of town. And that is a kind of low-lying, kind of swampy area. So a lot of our communities still live there, and it is prone to flooding and erosion and that type of stuff because of Dunwich being up on this kind of little soft hill, having most of the farmland, and then quarantine station later, and a lot of those colonial kind of buildings and institutions. Again, marginalized populations may struggle to adapt because of poor health outcomes, poor economic outcomes, all these things that kind of compound in on the same issue and make it really difficult to see what the process might be. But I also like to highlight that I think, and this is maybe my opinion, but I think it's true, that there's also a kind of lack of vulnerability within an inability for a system to change. So rigidity, you know, I've had a few chats this time, but that kind of capitalist colonial system ultimately is quite flexible. It can co-opt things really easily, like we see with green sustainability or greenwashing or other things. But ultimately, it is confined within this kind of paradigm of growth and expansion. And actually, that makes it kind of rigid. And so I think in the future, we're going to see quite a lot of, and I mean, we're already seeing it, but, you know, there is almost a willingness to kind of ignore some of those really heavy consequences that are going to happen. For example, Northern Sydney beaches, they will have to move eventually. I mean, you can't build rock walls forever. Manhattan is not, you know, Florida, these kind of inabilities to accept retraction or smallening of your system, you know, it's like a growth. So I think that's actually quite a big vulnerability. So here's a little side bit. This is Main Beach in Manduraba. It runs down the entire ocean side of the island. And you can see that we've had quite a few storms and other issues that are also exacerbated, that will be and are currently exacerbated by sea level rise. So if you see, you can see the dunes kind of where the high tide mark is starting to erode some of that dune system. It's a sand island, so it does kind of come and go, and it's hard to pinpoint necessarily what erosion is from climate or what erosion is from natural processes. But we do know that as it will compound those issues as we keep going. So I show this photo because I want to highlight a kind of issue with value. So behind those dunes is something we call 18 Mile Swamp. It is a very long kind of ancient freshwater system. And the elders are extremely concerned of saltwater intrusion into that swamp area because they know that it's connected to the aquifer. Now, that's not necessarily an area that people have been researching that much. But they're saying this is a real problem. If that breaks through, there's areas where it's already going, you know, there's concern. You know, the elders are adamant, and I've seen it before, that it will affect the quality of the groundwater. Now that groundwater is used, it's already filtered, so it's used for drinking water from Redland Shire through Brisbane to Logan, Gold Coast. It is a massive kind of, it gets kind of pumped out constantly. And, you know, there's a lot of fear that, one, it's not managed very well now. And so the question is whether or not it will be managed well in the future. Yeah, so the problem I guess I see is that there's no homes in that area. And the link between what the elders are saying and the values that they put towards that. And you can see a kind of tangential link to the safety of the water supply, but because of the kind of lack of energy put into that space, there's not really anything being done. So yeah, that's not good. And that kind of shows that value conflict, whereas they're saying we need to protect this asset because it's important to us, but also we know that it's important for everybody. So, but that there's that disconnect within the kind of governance system. All right. I think Indigenous resilience is an important concept because it's kind of brought up quite a lot. So oftentimes it's described in relation to our knowledges. But on the kind of other side of the hand, it's also often talked about it's localized within that context. So it's often just kind of said, you know, Indigenous people have knowledge about this local area, but it kind of discounts histories of incredible Indigenous networking through songlines in Australia, through these stories that are shared beyond national borders too. There's not like trade didn't occur between Indigenous Australia and the Pacific and all through Asia. It did, and we're very happy in that, you know, like that's not recognized because it goes against that narrative of Australia. But in America, there are trails. There's, you know, every culture has our version of that networking and that story, and we've heard heaps of different examples of that this week. So, yeah, and we are expert adapters. So there is a history of adaptation. So sea level rise after the last ice age period obviously was a period of extreme adaptation, but probably since then, the other major environmental or climate catastrophe was colonialism. So when the landscape was transformed into agricultural plots and basically given for free, all of the environment has changed. There is a changed environment in a lot of areas of Australia, and which introduced climate impacts, like actual larger scale impacts across the environment, from taking people off their country so they can't manage the landscape to all these different consequences. That is a huge impact that we are still adapting to today. So, you know, I don't like the word post-colonial. I don't think it is. I don't think we're in a post-colonial environment. I think we're in a colonial environment. I think it's still kind of, there's no real sense in saying, oh, well, we're past it now. I mean, I understand, you know, but I just think we're still in, you know, that's my opinion. So that there. But yeah, our epistemology, so our ways of knowing, and our ontologies, ways of being, but that country is special in Australia. There are deep and there are very spiritual connections to place, and those should be, you know, I think Australia should be proud of that history. And, you know, I also want to say that knowledge is held, you know, I'm a student, so I've navigated a Western knowledge system, but that knowledge, like profound knowledge, is in our elders. So I just want to really point that out, that sometimes, you know, that it's, you know, why there's a kind of, that kind of you know, that we acknowledge our elders is because that's where that knowledge is held fundamentally, and they can decide how and where that's shared. And there's, you know, that's important to respect. So here's a few more examples. This is a small adaptation behavioral change. So this is in 1 mile. Sorry, it's a nice photo. I took it for the sunset, but I thought it would also illustrate a point pretty well. So this is 1 mile foreshore in front of that area I was speaking about before. This is a gap. Now, in the old days, that used to be all sand because that's where people brought their boats up. But over time, that caused like heaps of erosion into that area and pullback. And so as the mangroves have regrown, and the reason is because people wanted that area clear for to bring their boats up and to repair fishing nets and all that stuff in the area, the elders would walk along and pick the mangrove saplings out to keep it sandy. So that's been a change in behavior. So now they're not doing that anymore. And so the mangroves are regrowing, and the areas where the mangroves are holding or building out, and like this little gap here, which is a creek, but it's pulling back. You can see it kind of coming back towards the road area. So that's just a kind of a behavior change in community. Adaptation is and always occurs at that local level. So this is a photo of Masig. You can see that in lieu of larger infrastructural changes to the beach, they've done a kind of barrier plus some vegetation, re-veg behind it. And at the moment, it's kind of, there's that struggle between that top-down kind of funding scheme and a general lack of trust, I think, in community decision-making, which is not specific to adaptation. I think that goes across lots of different community, you know, things where whether or not that's health or, you know, education, I think generally out of histories of kind of colonialism and racism, there's a lack of trust for community decision making, which isn't correct. You know, communities know what they're doing and often have the best advice to give. And that's where external expertise can come in and support that local expertise to kind of create a long-term kind of successful solution. So in the context of Masig, if this area gets seawalled, which is the likely response because it's a response that the system can kind of tick off and say, well, you know, it doesn't have that, it's got that kind of end date that you can just say, you know, you can sell it, right? Which may or may not be, you know, it will be needed eventually, but also it's important to recognize that that's a pathway of no change. Like once you have that, that's set. You can't change that after that. So it's important for communities to be able to negotiate that problem in their head before they make that choice. And the consequences to turtle habitation and lots of other things need to be thought through before you make that choice, because there's going to need to be some adjustment there. And I just wanted to talk about self-determination a little bit. That's a photo I took at Tidal River, Wilson's Prom. I just took it because it's a nice kind of representation and it's a different country. And I think it's cool. So that's, yeah, I really like that photo. And this is just a quote from Uncle Dennis Foley, which I really like, just talking about that relationship with land and where that decision-making can come from. And I guess as well, I think we need to think about as a country see, the problem with self-determination is that it's often bounded, right? There's clear boundaries within which self-determination can be allowed by the colonial system, and anything that kind of goes out and starts challenging those things. Like if you go to the government website about it, you know, it's pretty clear. It's at the end they say, oh, but this is not Indigenous statehood, so just everyone relax, you know. But why not? Like, I mean, you know, it may not be that communities want that, but at the end of the day, like, if you want to strengthen self-determination, those conversations need to be had, and barriers, that tight barrier around that concept needs to be kind of broken down. So, yeah, and I also want to just leave you with a kind of a rhetorical question, I guess, which is, can we be confident that settler states, as the kind of architects of climate change as we see it today, can we be confident that they are going to be able to enact climate change that is in any way beneficial for Indigenous communities? And shout out to that maladaptation to adaptation timeline. You know, will we see maladaptive solutions be kind of implemented across Indigenous communities, because there's a lack of understanding of the values and the cultural values held in those communities because of histories and kind of systemic problems around engagement, listening, you know, power. So yeah, I thought I'd leave you with that, and whether or not we can have appropriate adaptation within that context. So yeah, that's a rhetorical question. Maybe we can talk about it later. Not sure, but yeah, that's my contacts again. Thanks, everyone.